Hi everyone, it's Bennett, one of the hosts of Theory Night in Canada. This video has been a long time coming, but there isn't really any reason for that. I've just been lazy. But with one of our hosts out of the country this week, I might as well use the time I would have used to prepare for this week's episode recording this. So without further ado, here's part 3 of our celebrated Capital Volume 1 series. This week we'll be tackling the production of absolute surplus value. As I said last time, I will not be covering in detail old definitions we established in previous videos. Make sure you watch the previous videos before watching this one. They're not very long, and this one hopefully won't be either. So let's get started with Chapter 7, the labor process and the process of producing surplus value. Labor power, which is what free laborers are selling on the labor market, is a commodity just like any other. It is purchased to be consumed by employers in order to wring surplus value out of it. The consumption of this labor power occurs in the expenditure of the laborer for the agreed amount of labor time for the employer in the labor process. This consumption can either occur productively to produce commodities or non-productively for some other purpose. In Marx's time, the overwhelming amount of labor in the developed world was of this first productive type. But over the past century, a growing segment of the population has become employed in non-productive labor, in, for example, the financial and real estate sectors. See the late David Graeber's Bullshit Jobs, which is the only time I'll be plugging anarchist theory on this channel. For the purpose of this video, though, we're only going to be concerned with productive labor. While non-productive labor still may generate surplus value, the mechanism is a lot more convoluted. The labor process for productive labor, more thoroughly defined, can be thought of as the transformation of the employer's input goods and industrial machinery into an output commodity. As shown in the diagram on the bottom of this slide, input goods are consumed and combined in their totality, and a portion of the machinery is also expended, in the form of wear and tear, with labor power acting as a catalyst for this process. The result is an output good, which contains value transferred from the input goods and machinery, as well as from the consumed labor power. If you have even a passing awareness of Marx, via cultural osmosis, you've certainly heard the phrase, to seize the means of production. This is what is meant by the means of production. The means of production is not just the machinery of industrial production, but also the input goods and labor power inherent to the labor process. Now, I know I said no reviewing past concepts, but it is important that you remember where surplus value comes from. We discussed surplus value in a previous video, which is the value collected in excess of the value invested by the capitalist after the final output commodity has been sold, and we also discussed its origin, which is solely from the expenditure of labor. All value expansion from the labor process occurs from the embodiment of new labor added during the process into the output commodity. This value expansion is the only source of reliable profit. That is not to say that in individual cases you can't derive profit from other things, but in the average case, surplus value comes only from labor power's expenditure. This infusion of the output good with new labor via the labor process is one of the two value transformations a laborer engages in during production. The other is the transfer of the whole value of the input goods and the partial value of the machinery used into the value of the output good. It should be noted that within certain bounds, the total value is transferred, not just whatever portion of the input goods are expended usefully. There is a socially necessary waste inherent to the productive process, as partial chemical reactions, average number of accidents and mistakes, and other waste sources will occur no matter how smoothly or strictly a factory is run. Besides the raw input goods, for example, coal and iron to produce steel, a certain amount of value is transferred from the machinery used in the output commodity. As machinery is used, or even just as it exists, it slowly deteriorates. It chips, it rusts, etc. The expected amount of deterioration of industrial machinery is also transferred into the product by the labor process. Marx divides capital as machinery and input goods, and capital as labor power into separate categories, which he calls constant and variable. Constant capital are all input commodities that are not labor power. Marx refers to these input commodities as constant capital because they impart only the value of past labor into the output commodity, i.e., their value is constant. Variable capital, by process of elimination then, is the labor power commodity, which imparts as much labor time as it takes to perform the labor process, a shifting amount of time dependent on ever-changing conditions of production, hence variable capital. If you find this terminology confusing or counterintuitive, that's okay. Marx himself admits that constant capital is not actually constant in value, as the value of input goods shifts with the socially necessary labor value of those goods, and exchange value is also affected by supply and demand. But he uses these terms anyways to highlight the fact that constant capital is dead labor, congealed into already produced products, while variable capital is the living labor of the present labor process. So I let chapter 7 and 8 mix together there, but let's move on now to chapter 9 and discuss the rate of surplus value. The decomposition of capital into constant and variable parts discussed in chapter 8 allows us to calculate a labor process's degree of exploitation. Remember the commodity circuit CMC, selling in order to purchase, and MCM, buying in order to sell, and how we could link these circuits into a chain of C and M, like MC, MCM, etc. We can think of that circuit in relation to our labor process and surplus value. Our capitalist starts with money M and uses it to buy a set of commodities C, which includes elements of constant capital, such as input goods and industrial machinery, and also includes a portion of labor power from the labor market as variable capital. In consuming these capital inputs through a labor process, the capitalist modifies C into some augmented C prime, an output commodity, which includes the values of the initial investment plus the new surplus value created by the variable capital. The capitalist then sells C prime for a profit. Marx defines the degree of exploitation of labor power in a labor process as the ratio between surplus value and variable capital. In common language, this ratio is how much time you spend laboring for your employer compared to the time you spend laboring for yourself, although this analogy can lead to confusion, as we will see later. As Marx is often wont to do, he uses a real-world example from the English economy. Here we have the average expenditure and profit of capitalist farmers in England in 1815. They expended on average £1 9 shillings on seed and £2 10 shillings on manure, their constant capital expenditure. They also doled out £3 10 shillings in wages to their various agricultural labourers, their variable capital expenditure. Discounting these £7 9 shillings they spent, they receive not just those £7 9 shillings back, but a further £1 1 shilling from interest, £1 8 shillings in rent from their tenant farmers, and £1 2 shillings in other profit, for a total profit above the initial expenditure of £3 11 shillings. When comparing the total profit surplus value extracted to the variable capital wages, we get a degree of exploitation above 100% for the average farm laborer in England in 1815. In other words, more than half the day is surplus time returned to the employer. The portion of the final capital value received by a capitalist from their initial investment following the labor process, that is surplus value, can be equivocated to a portion of the output commodity. As an example, if the owner of a textile mill invested 24 shillings in wool and spinning machines and 3 shillings in wages, yielding yarn with a value of 30 shillings, 6 shillings of labor value has been transferred by the laborer into the output commodity. 1/5 of the yarn's value is new value that did not exist in circulation before this point, and the remaining 4/5 is from the previous labor processes congealed into the input goods and machinery. In this case, we have a degree of exploitation of exactly 100%, 3 shillings over 3 shillings, as the surplus value equals the wages. As this is 1/10, this surplus value, of the final product's value, we can say that 1/10 of the final value is surplus value. Because 1/10 of the yarn contains within it 1/10 of the value of the yarn, we can imagine physical portions of the yarn as embodying various inputs to the labor process by dividing the yarn into portions equal to the discrete value of our inputs. 80% of the produced yarn contains within it the value transferred from the constant capital inputs, 10% of the produced yarn contains within it the value transferred from the variable capital, and 10% of the produced yarn contains within it pure surplus value. This concentrated surplus value portion is what Marx refers to as the surplus product, i.e., the physical product produced beyond the amount necessary to merely repeat the labor process. Before we move on to chapter 10, as I foreshadowed a few slides ago, let's talk about Senior's last hour, the result of an easy misconception of the nature of surplus value. Throughout the 19th century, the length of the working day was a pressing political issue, with the working class agitating for its shortening and the manufacturer demanding its maintenance or even lengthening. Enter Nassau W. Senior, an economist employed at Oxford University. Now, it should be noted that Senior was his last name, not his title. He did not have a kid named Nassau W. Jr. The latest bill proposed at the time for shortening the working day in 1837 was a bill reducing the working day from 11 to 10 hours for British workers. Nassau pointed out that the average surplus time was 1 hour in British textile mills. So, he claimed, reducing the working day by 1 hour would eliminate the surplus time and reduce profits to zero. And since the British economy was so dependent on textile manufacturing, the British economy would collapse. Obviously, the working day was eventually reduced below 11 hours, and the British economy didn't collapse, so why was Senior wrong? His error was assuming that necessary labor time and surplus labor time occur sequentially and discretely, which is incorrect. Surplus labor is a portion of total labor, not an addendum to it. If you reduce the workday by 10% in an industry with 10% surplus value, you do not reduce surplus value by 100%, but by 10%. The surplus labor time is interwoven with the necessary labor time. As long as labor time remains above the minimum necessary labor time to reproduce labor power, surplus value does not go away. Discussing Senior's last hour is a good segue from talking about surplus value rates to talking about one of the premier mainstream class struggles of Marx's era, the length of the working day, which Marx dedicates all of Chapter 10 to discussing. Regardless of social organization, whether capitalist or feudal or even communist, work needs to be done by some or all of the population. There are two hard limits on this working day, a minimum and a maximum. The minimum extent of the working day is the socially necessary labor time required to reproduce solely the needs of the laborer, i.e. a working day with zero surplus time and zero surplus product. On the other hand, the maximum extent of the working day is the labor time beyond which replenishing labor power becomes impossible. Human beings need rest and recreation to produce at full capacity. If the working day is extended beyond this maximum, productivity degrades steadily to zero, as the laboring class is unable to sustain itself. Under capitalism, where work is performed by certain classes and profit collected by others, two interest groups form, pulling on opposite ends of the length of the working day. Laborers naturally want the working day reduced to as close to the necessary labor time as possible, as they are only effectively paid for that portion of the day, while capitalists naturally want the working day extended to as close to the natural maximum as possible to expand the rate of surplus value. By the moral logic of the market, both of these positions are correct positions to hold. In this fight over the length of the working day, the bargaining position of the employer is much stronger, because participation in the labor market is compulsory, so the decision faced by the working class is between starvation and employment. The position of an individual worker is exceptionally weak, especially for unskilled laborers. For unskilled labor, the labor pool supply is so immense that it forces the laborer to make as many concessions as possible to secure employment, to make themselves a more worthy hire than the alternatives, which includes incredibly long work hours, trending towards the legal maximum. But there exists a counter to this upward pressure on the working day due to the unbalance between employer and employee: class struggle. When the working class realizes their inferior bargaining position to the ruling classes, they can channel that class consciousness into collective action, principally the labor movement and the Communist Party. The fruits of this collective action in Marx's day were the gradual whittling of the working day from 16 to 12 to 10 hours. The bourgeoisie, though, are also capable of collective action and are aware of their class position, and can exercise their incredible power in reactionary politics, extending the working day and weakening labor's bargaining power. While the 19th century saw a trend downward in working hours, it also saw brief spikes in working hours, and was preceded by centuries of acts creating compulsory minimum working day lengths for Britain's agricultural laborers. The fact that workers can only work for, say, 16 hours, otherwise they'll die, means that factories could lie dormant for 8 hours. During these 8 hours of inactivity, input goods and machinery could decay, and no surplus value could be generated. To get around this, capitalists in the 19th century invented the relay system, which we today would call shift work. Via the shift system, twice the workers could work during the day without also doubling the number of machines necessary to be purchased. Essentially, the capitalist gets 2 working days in one span of time. The existence of shift work is a major bourgeois W. Not only does it allow greater exploitation and reduce the amount of unproductive wear on machinery and input goods, it also increases the precarity of the workforce, who don't know their working schedules in advance and are therefore further weakened in terms of bargaining power. Moving on from the working day to Chapter 11, Rate and Mass of Surplus Value, let's talk about the difference between rate and mass. Recall from 2 chapters ago that we have a degree of exploitation defined as the ratio between surplus value and variable capital investment. On an individual basis, the average laborer is exploited to this degree, but we can determine how much exploitation occurs overall in an enterprise by multiplying this individual exploitation by the size of the workforce. We have a system of equations, then, where S is the mass of surplus value, the total amount of surplus value extracted overall, shown in this system at the bottom of the slide. V in this system is the sum total variable capital advanced for the labor process. N is the number of laborers employed. Uppercase P is the average labor power, and A prime over A is the ratio between total and necessary labor. What we see from these equations is that reductions in the number of workers employed can be offset by increasing the length of the working day, decreasing the socially necessary labor time through innovation, or increasing capital and investment. In other words, even if the rate of profit declines, and more on that in a future video, the overall magnitude of surplus value can still increase if investment increases, socially necessary labor time goes down, or the length of the working day goes up. And that's really what capitalists want. The desire for an increase in rate of surplus value is merely a means to an end, and the augmentation of the mass of surplus value collected. Your average company owner would rather bring in $1 billion of revenue on a $500 million investment than $500 million of revenue on a $100 million investment, even though the rate of return on the second is much higher than the rate of return on the first. The mass of surplus value is larger. The mass of surplus value extracted is the difference between 2 very similar classes in society. The petite bourgeoisie, the small business owners, smallholding farmers, etc., who employ a small group of people, and the regular old bourgeoisie billionaires and multimillionaires. The petite bourgeoisie don't extract enough surplus value from their employees to remove themselves from the labor process. A mechanic who employs 3 people still needs to work on cars in his own shop to make ends meet, but the owner of a private company with thousands of employees can live an idle life if he really wants to, although often for the detriment of their own company, they do not. The exact mass of surplus value required to distinguish the petite bourgeoisie from the bourgeoisie is dependent on shifting social conditions, and the line is very fuzzy. It's obvious that the owner of an independent restaurant is petit bourgeois and Elon Musk is bourgeois, but where is the exact line where one class shifts into the other? It is hard to tell. As Marx puts it, merely quantitative differences beyond a certain point pass into qualitative changes, and the idea he directly claims is inspired by his old professor and mentor, Hegel. In summary of Part 3, when labor power is expended to create commodities, it is productive labor. Labor power, input goods, and industrial machinery altogether are the means of production, and the action of the means of production is the labor process. The input goods and machinery used in the labor process are constant capital, transferring only their initial values directly to the final good, while the labor power used in the labor process is variable capital. The ratio between the surplus value extracted by the purchaser of labor power and the initial variable capital investment is the degree of exploitation, or rate of surplus value. The proletariat and bourgeoisie make up the core classes of a two-way class struggle, with the proletariat being directly invested in reducing the working day, and increasing investment in superfluous things, so-called, like safety, etc., and therefore reducing the rate of surplus value, while the bourgeoisie are invested in increasing the rate of surplus value, and therefore increasing the working day. Above even rate of surplus value, the ultimate aim of capitalists is the augmentation of their mass of surplus value, the total surplus value they extract from their investment in the labor process. And finally, the division between the petite bourgeoisie and bourgeoisie lies in the relative masses of surplus value owned by the two classes. That rounds out Part 3. Once again, sorry for taking so long. In the next part, we'll discuss Part 4 of Capital Volume 1. the production of relative surplus value. Thanks for watching. Bye.